The marble floors of the Grandview shopping center gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, reflecting the polished shoes of shoppers who moved with purpose and privilege. It was the kind of place where money whispered rather than shouted, where designer bags hung from manicured fingers and conversations centered around vacation homes and stock portfolios. The scent of expensive perfume mingled with the aroma from the gourmet coffee shop, creating an atmosphere of refined comfort that made outsiders feel instantly unwelcome. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Wellington III adjusted his platinum Rolex and straightened the cuffs of his custom-tailored shirt as he strode through the center's main corridor. At 38, he had inherited more wealth than most people could spend in 10 lifetimes, and his demeanor made it clear he knew exactly how superior that made him. His coal-black hair was perfectly styled, his jaw clean-shaven, and his gray eyes held the cold calculation of a man who measured human worth in dollar signs. Behind him trailed his usual entourage of admirers and business associates, all eager to bask in the glow of his fortune and connections. The Wellington name carried weight in this city. Marcus's grandfather had built a shipping empire from nothing, his father had diversified into real estate and technology, and Marcus himself had turned those investments into a financial juggernaut that controlled everything from luxury hotels to high-end retail chains. He owned 3 homes, 4 cars worth more than most people's houses, and a yacht that rarely left its marina berth. Yet for all his material success, there was something hollow behind his confident exterior, a restlessness that no amount of money seemed able to fill. As the group approached the center's main entrance, Marcus was in the middle of regaling his audience with a story about his latest acquisition when he spotted something that made his perfectly sculpted features twist into a mask of disgust. Near the ornate fountain that served as the shopping center's centerpiece sat a man who clearly didn't belong in this temple of commerce and consumption. The stranger appeared to be in his 50s, though the lines etched deep into his weathered face made it difficult to determine his exact age. His clothes were clean but obviously second-hand, a faded denim jacket over a plain gray sweater and jeans that had seen better days. His brown hair was neatly combed but needed a professional cut, and his beard, while trimmed, showed streaks of premature silver. Most telling of all was the worn canvas backpack at his feet and the small cardboard sign propped against his knee that simply read, "Anything helps. God bless." What struck Marcus most, however, wasn't the man's obvious poverty but his demeanor. Unlike the aggressive panhandlers who sometimes harassed shoppers outside, this man sat quietly with his hands folded in his lap, making no attempt to call attention to himself or guilt passers-by into donations. His blue eyes were clear and alert, scanning the crowd not with desperation but with a strange sort of compassion, as if he genuinely cared about the strangers who hurried past without acknowledging his existence. Marcus felt his jaw clench with indignation. The audacity of this vagrant to plant himself in the heart of their exclusive shopping district was beyond comprehension. This was a place for people of substance, for those who had earned the right to enjoy life's finer pleasures through hard work and intelligent investment. The presence of this beggar was not just an eyesore but an insult to everyone who had achieved something meaningful with their lives. Before he could stop himself, Marcus found his feet carrying him toward the fountain. His entourage followed, sensing drama and eager to witness their leader put this interloper in his place. The conversations of nearby shoppers began to fade as people noticed the well-dressed businessman approaching the homeless man with obvious hostile intent. Thomas Mitchell looked up as the shadow fell across his weathered hands. He had been sitting by the fountain for less than an hour, not actively soliciting but simply resting and hoping that someone might spare $1 or $2 for a meal. He had learned long ago that aggressive panhandling only brought trouble, and his quiet dignity had served him better than any sales pitch ever could. But as he met the cold gray eyes of the expensively dressed man looming over him, Thomas sensed that trouble had found him anyway. Marcus stared down at the homeless man for a long moment, allowing the silence to build dramatic tension for his audience. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I don't think you understand where you are." Thomas tilted his head slightly, his expression remaining calm and respectful. "I'm sorry, sir." I don't believe I'm breaking any laws by sitting here. The response only fueled Marcus's indignation. The man's voice was educated, articulate, which somehow made his presence even more offensive. Here was someone who clearly possessed the intelligence to better his situation, yet chose instead to leech off the generosity of his betters. Laws? Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of any real humor. Maybe not technically, but you're certainly breaking the unwritten rules of common decency. This is a premium shopping destination, not a homeless shelter. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the spectacle of wealth confronting poverty in such a public setting. Some watched with uncomfortable fascination, others with outright disapproval of Marcus's aggressive approach. A few pulled out their phones, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Thomas remained seated, his hands still folded peacefully in his lap. I understand your concern, sir, and I have no intention of bothering anyone. I'm simply resting. Resting? Marcus's voice rose slightly, his composure beginning to crack. With a begging sign in your hand out? Don't insult my intelligence. You're here because you know this is where the money is, where successful people come to enjoy the fruits of their labor. And you think you can just sit there and guilt us into subsidizing your failures. The words hung in the air like a slap, their cruelty evident to everyone within earshot. Several shoppers shifted uncomfortably, clearly disturbed by the public humiliation they were witnessing. But Marcus was just getting started. He gestured broadly at Thomas's modest attire and worn backpack. Look at you. What are you, 50? 55? At your age, you should have built something by now. A career, a family, a legacy. Instead, you're sitting on a public fountain begging for handouts from people who actually made something of themselves. Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady. You don't know anything about my life, sir. I know enough, Marcus shot back. I know you're sitting here with your hat out instead of working. I know you're taking up space in an establishment where families come to shop and children come to play. I know that whatever choices led you to this point, they were obviously the wrong ones. One of Marcus's associates, a thin man in an expensive suit named Bradley Henderson, stepped forward with a cruel smile. Maybe he's collecting for some charity, he suggested mockingly. What's your cause, friend? Save the whales? Feed the hungry? Oh wait, that would be yourself. The group erupted in sycophantic laughter, their voices echoing off the marble walls and drawing even more attention from passing shoppers. Thomas absorbed their ridicule without flinching, though something flickered deep in his blue eyes that suggested their words were hitting their mark more than he cared to admit. Marcus felt emboldened by his audience's approval. This was exactly the kind of decisive leadership that had made him so successful in business. Sometimes you had to make the hard choices, deliver the uncomfortable truths that others were too weak to voice. You know what your real problem is? Marcus continued, his voice gaining momentum. You've given up. You've accepted defeat and decided that the world owes you something just for existing. Well, let me tell you something about the real world. Success isn't handed out like charity. It's earned through sacrifice, intelligence, and determination. He gestured to himself and his well-dressed companions. Every person standing here has worked for what they have. We've made difficult decisions, taken calculated risks, and accepted responsibility for our outcomes. That's how society functions. That's how progress happens. But people like you, you're dead weight. You're a drain on the system that productive people have built. Thomas finally stood up, his movement slow and deliberate. Even in his worn clothes, there was something dignified about his posture, a quiet strength that hadn't been broken despite whatever hardships had brought him to this point. He was taller than Marcus had expected, and the direct eye contact seemed to unsettle the wealthy man slightly. I appreciate your concern for society's well-being, Thomas said quietly. But I think you might be surprised by what some people have contributed. The response caught Marcus off guard. There was no anger in Thomas's voice, no defensive hostility. Instead, there was something almost pitying in his tone, as if he felt sorry for Marcus rather than intimidated by him. The unexpected reaction threw off Marcus's rhythm and made him even angrier. Contributed? Marcus scoffed. What could you possibly have contributed? You're sitting on a fountain begging for loose change. Your greatest achievement today will be scraping together enough money for a meal at McDonald's. Marcus, one of the female shoppers in the crowd, spoke up, her voice carrying a note of disapproval. I think that's enough. But Marcus was too deep into his performance to stop now. The adrenaline of public confrontation had awakened something predatory in his nature, and he sensed weakness in Thomas's refusal to fight back. In the corporate world, showing mercy was often interpreted as weakness, and Marcus had built his fortune by never showing weakness to anyone. No, actually, I don't think it is enough, Marcus declared, turning to address the growing crowd. This is exactly what's wrong with our society today. We've become so politically correct, so afraid of hurt feelings, that we can't even call a failure anymore. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He pointed directly at Thomas. This man is a living example of wasted potential. Whatever excuses he's made for himself, whatever sob story brought him here, the bottom line is that he's chosen dependency over self-reliance. And by enabling that choice with our misguided sympathy, we're actually doing him a disservice. Thomas picked up his cardboard sign and carefully folded it in half. The simple action seemed to deflate some of the tension in the air, as if he was preparing to leave rather than escalate the confrontation. But instead of walking away, he bent down and picked up his backpack, holding it in his hands with an almost reverent care. You mentioned contributions, Thomas said softly, his eyes meeting Marcus's with an intensity that made the wealthy man take an involuntary step backward. Would you like to know what's in here? Something in Thomas's voice had changed. The deferential politeness was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that seemed to emanate from deep within. The crowd sensed the shift too, leaning in closer with anticipation. Marcus felt a flicker of uncertainty but pushed it aside. Whatever pathetic possessions this vagrant carried in his worn backpack, they couldn't possibly challenge the fundamental truth of their respective positions in life. Marcus was rich, successful, powerful. This man was homeless, defeated, irrelevant. No amount of sentimental mementos could change those basic facts. I'm sure it's fascinating, Marcus replied sarcastically. Let me guess. Family photos? Letters from loved ones? Maybe a few precious keepsakes from your glory days? Thomas unzipped the main compartment of his backpack with steady hands. Something like that, he said quietly. The crowd pressed closer, their collective curiosity overriding their discomfort with the ugly scene they had just witnessed. Even Marcus found himself leaning forward slightly, despite his determination to maintain his superior detachment. What Thomas pulled out first was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and handled so frequently that the creases had begun to wear thin. He unfolded it carefully and held it up so that Marcus could see the official letterhead and formal language that marked it as some kind of government document. This is a citation, Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly across the marble floor. It was awarded to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Mitchell for extraordinary heroism during Operation Desert Storm. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Lieutenant Colonel. Military service. Heroism. These were concepts that existed in a completely different universe from the narrative he had constructed about this homeless beggar. Thomas wasn't finished. From the backpack came another document, this one more recent but bearing the seal of the Department of Defense. This is my honorable discharge notice, he continued. After 24 years of service to my country. A murmur ran through the crowd, voices dropping to respectful whispers as the true scope of Marcus's mistake became apparent. The homeless man they had been watching get humiliated was actually a decorated military veteran, someone who had literally put his life on the line for their freedom. But Thomas still wasn't done. The next item he withdrew was a photograph, bent at the corners but still clearly showing a younger version of himself in full military dress uniform, standing beside a woman in a white dress and holding a small child. The image radiated happiness and hope, capturing a moment when the future had seemed full of promise. "This is my wife Sarah and my daughter Emma," Thomas said, his voice growing softer. "Sarah died 3 years ago from cancer. The medical bills took everything we had saved, and then some. Emma is in her 2nd year of college now, studying to be a teacher. She doesn't know I'm here. She thinks I'm staying with a friend while I get back on my feet." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as the full weight of his misjudgment crashed down on him. This wasn't some lazy grifter looking for an easy handout. This was a man who had served his country with distinction, who had sacrificed everything to save his wife's life, and who was now enduring homelessness in order to protect his daughter's pride and future. Thomas reached into the backpack one final time and withdrew something that made several people in the crowd gasp audibly. It was a Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, its distinctive blue ribbon and gold star catching the light as Thomas held it reverently in his weathered hands. "This was awarded to me for actions during a rescue mission in Iraq," Thomas said simply. 17 soldiers came home because of what my unit did that day. One of them was a young lieutenant named David Chin. He lives in this city now. He's a successful doctor with a family of his own. He still sends me Christmas cards." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as the true magnitude of his behavior became clear. He had just publicly humiliated and berated a genuine American hero, a man who had risked everything for his country and his family. The wealthy businessman's expensive clothes and imported watch suddenly felt like costume jewelry compared to the authentic valor represented by the simple medal in Thomas's hands. The crowd around them had grown to over 30 people, and the expressions on their faces ranged from shame to anger to profound respect for the homeless veteran. Several people were openly weeping, moved by the dignity with which Thomas had endured Marcus's cruel assault and the grace with which he had revealed his true identity. Thomas carefully returned each item to his backpack, his movements deliberate and precise. When everything was secured, he stood and faced Marcus directly. There was no anger in his expression, no desire for revenge or retribution. Instead, there was something far more devastating to Marcus's sense of self-worth: disappointment. "I don't tell people these things to make them feel sorry for me," Thomas said quietly. "I tell them because sometimes we make assumptions about people based on what we see on the surface. Sometimes the person sitting on a bench isn't there because they're lazy or worthless. Sometimes they're there because life dealt them a series of blows that would have broken most people completely." He shouldered his backpack with the practiced ease of someone who had carried far heavier burdens. "You asked what I've contributed to society, Mr. Wellington. I've given it 24 years of my life, a piece of my soul, and very nearly everything else I had. But more than that, I've tried to maintain the values I was taught to fight for. Honor, compassion, respect for human dignity. Even when times are hard, even when people judge me without knowing my story." The use of his name sent another shock through Marcus. Somehow, this homeless veteran had recognized him, had known exactly who was insulting him, yet had chosen to respond with dignity rather than expose Marcus's cruelty for what it was. Thomas turned to address the crowd that had gathered. "I want to thank everyone for listening. It wasn't my intention to cause a scene or make anyone uncomfortable. I know some of you are probably wondering if there's anything you can do to help, and I appreciate that kindness more than you know." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of the shoppers who had witnessed his humiliation and vindication. "But if you really want to help, don't just help me. There are veterans in this city who are struggling with PTSD, with addiction, with the challenge of translating military skills into civilian careers. There are families dealing with medical bankruptcies just like mine. There are people who have made mistakes and are trying to rebuild their lives." His gaze returned to Marcus, who still stood frozen in shocked silence. "The world is full of people whose stories you don't know, whose struggles you can't see. Before you judge someone's worth based on their current circumstances, remember that you're only seeing one chapter of a much longer book." With that, Thomas Mitchell turned and walked toward the shopping center's exit, his posture straight and his dignity intact despite everything he had endured. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many of them following the veteran with obvious respect and several pressing money into his hands as they passed. Marcus remained by the fountain, abandoned by his entourage and surrounded by the stares of people who had witnessed his spectacular failure of character. For the first time in his adult life, his wealth and status offered him no protection from the consequences of his actions. He was exposed, revealed as someone who had confused material success with moral superiority, who had mistaken privilege for wisdom. The revelation of Thomas's true identity sent shockwaves through the Grandview shopping center that extended far beyond the marble floors where the confrontation had taken place. Within minutes, videos of the encounter were uploaded to social media platforms, shared and reshared by witnesses who had captured different angles of Marcus Wellington's public humiliation of a decorated war hero. The hashtag veteran shaming began trending locally, accompanied by commentary that ranged from outrage to heartbroken. Marcus stood alone by the fountain for nearly 10 minutes after Thomas had departed, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. His carefully constructed worldview, built on the assumption that financial success was the ultimate measure of human worth, had been shattered by a homeless man carrying a Medal of Honor in a worn backpack. The whispered conversations of passing shoppers felt like daggers, each glance in his direction a reminder of his spectacular misjudgment. Bradley Henderson, the sycophantic associate who had joined in mocking Thomas, approached Marcus with visible nervousness. "Marcus, maybe we should go. People are starting to record everything, and I think some of them recognized you." Indeed, several shoppers were now pointing their phones in Marcus's direction, documenting the aftermath of his encounter with Thomas Mitchell. The social media posts were already beginning to identify him by name, complete with unflattering commentary about his treatment of a veteran. His personal assistant's phone had started buzzing incessantly with calls from reporters and social media managers asking for comment on the viral video. "Sir," his assistant Jenny Chen spoke up hesitantly, approaching with his phone in her hands. "Channel 7 News is requesting an interview about the incident. They're running a story tonight about homeless veterans, and they want your perspective on what happened here." Marcus snatched the phone from her hands, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. The last thing he needed was to have his moment of poor judgment broadcast to the entire city. He had built his public image carefully over the years, cultivating a reputation as a successful entrepreneur and philanthropist. This single encounter threatened to undo decades of public relations work. But even as his immediate instinct was to flee and attempt damage control, something about Thomas's dignified response to his cruelty nagged at Marcus's conscience. The veteran's refusal to respond with anger or bitterness had been more devastating than any confrontational counterattack could have been. There was something profoundly unsettling about being shown such grace in the face of deliberate humiliation. As Marcus finally forced himself to leave the shopping center, his mind kept returning to the contents of Thomas's backpack. The Medal of Honor had been genuine, he was certain of that. The citation and discharge papers had borne the official seals and formatting that would be impossible to fake convincingly. More importantly, there had been something in Thomas's demeanor when he handled those documents, a reverence and pride that could only come from authentic experience. The drive back to Marcus's penthouse apartment was conducted in tense silence, his usual entourage subdued by the awkwardness of what they had witnessed. The luxurious interior of his custom Mercedes felt suffocating rather than comforting, each symbol of his wealth now seeming to mock him rather than validate his success. When they reached his building, Marcus dismissed everyone curtly, wanting nothing more than to be alone with his thoughts. His penthouse occupied the entire 42nd floor of the city's most exclusive residential tower, offering panoramic views of the metropolitan area through floor-to-ceiling windows. The interior was a showcase of expensive taste and unlimited budget, filled with original artwork, custom furniture, and technology that most people could only dream of owning. Yet as Marcus stood in his living room, staring out at the glittering lights of the city below, he felt more isolated than he had ever felt in his life. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was surrounded by luxury while Thomas Mitchell would likely spend another night on the streets or in a shelter. The veteran's mention of his daughter believing he was staying with friends suggested a man so proud that he would rather endure homelessness than burden his child with knowledge of his circumstances. It was a level of self-sacrifice that Marcus found difficult to comprehend, having never been required to put anyone else's needs before his own desires. His personal laptop chimed with notification after notification as the story of his encounter with Thomas continued to spread across social media. The comments ranged from disappointed to outright hostile, with many people expressing shock that someone of Marcus's supposed stature would treat a veteran so callously. Several business associates had already reached out with concerned messages, worried about how the incident might reflect on their professional relationships with him. But it was a private message from his younger sister Caroline that cut deepest. She lived in Seattle now, working as a social worker with homeless populations, and had apparently seen the video through mutual friends. Her message was brief but devastating. "Marcus, I'm ashamed to share your last name right now. That man served our country while you were inheriting your fortune. How could you be so cruel?" Caroline had always been the moral compass of the Wellington family, the one who had chosen public service over private profit despite their father's disapproval. She had volunteered at soup kitchens during high school, spent her college summers building houses with Habitat for Humanity, and dedicated her career to helping society's most vulnerable members. Her opinion had always mattered to Marcus more than he cared to admit, and her disappointment struck him like a physical blow. Unable to bear the silence of his empty apartment any longer, Marcus found himself walking out onto his private balcony. The night air was crisp and clear, carrying sounds from the city below that seemed muffled by his elevation and isolation. Somewhere down there, Thomas Mitchell was preparing for another night without the comfort and security that Marcus took for granted. The thought filled him with an unfamiliar emotion that he slowly recognized as shame. His phone rang, interrupting his brooding contemplation. The caller ID showed his mother's number, and Marcus briefly considered letting it go to voicemail. Eleanor Wellington was a formidable woman who had never hesitated to express her disapproval when her children failed to live up to her exacting standards. But avoiding her would only delay the inevitable confrontation. "Marcus," his mother's voice was cold and clipped. "I just finished watching the most disturbing video I've ever seen of my own son. Please tell me there's some context I'm missing that would explain why you publicly humiliated a Medal of Honor recipient." The disappointment in Eleanor's voice was even more painful than Caroline's written condemnation. Despite their complicated relationship, Marcus had always craved his mother's approval and respect. Hearing her speak to him with such obvious disgust made him feel like a child again, caught in some shameful act and unable to justify his behavior. "Mother, I didn't know he was a veteran when I approached him," Marcus said weakly. "I just saw someone who appeared to be panhandling in an inappropriate location." "So that makes it acceptable?" Eleanor's voice rose slightly, a rare display of emotion from a woman known for her composure. "Since when do we judge people's worth based on their current circumstances? Since when do we treat any human being with such contempt, regardless of their background?" The questions hung in the air, demanding answers that Marcus didn't have. He had acted on instinct and prejudice, making assumptions about Thomas's character based solely on his appearance and situation. The revelation of the veteran's true identity had exposed the fundamental cruelty of that approach, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about Marcus's own values and priorities. "Your father and I didn't raise you to be so heartless," Eleanor continued. "The Wellington name has always been associated with dignity and respect, even when we disagreed with people. What you did today was beneath our family's standards, and it's certainly beneath the standards of any decent human being." After ending the painful conversation with his mother, Marcus poured himself a generous measure of scotch and settled into his leather chair, trying to make sense of the emotions churning in his chest. He had built his adult identity around the belief that success justified everything, that his achievements gave him the right to look down on those who had achieved less. Thomas Mitchell's story had shattered that comfortable delusion, revealing it as nothing more than selfish rationalization. The veteran's daughter was studying to become a teacher, a profession that required intelligence, dedication, and genuine desire to help others. His wife had died fighting cancer, a battle that no amount of money could guarantee winning. Thomas himself had served his country with such distinction that he had been awarded the nation's highest honor for valor. These were accomplishments that had nothing to do with financial gain and everything to do with character, sacrifice, and service to others. Marcus found himself wondering what his own legacy would be if he died tomorrow. He had made money, certainly, and lots of it. He had built a business empire that provided jobs and generated profits. But had he ever risked his life for another person? Had he ever sacrificed his own comfort for the greater good? Had he ever done anything that would be remembered and honored decades after his death? The honest answer was sobering. For all his wealth and success, Marcus realized that he had lived an essentially selfish existence, focused primarily on accumulating more of what he already had in abundance. He had never been tested the way Thomas Mitchell had been tested, never forced to choose between his own interests and a higher calling. The veteran's quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation suggested a strength of character that Marcus wasn't sure he possessed. As the night wore on and the city lights blurred together below his penthouse windows, Marcus found himself thinking about Thomas's mention of other veterans struggling with similar challenges. How many decorated heroes were living on the streets, their service forgotten and their sacrifices unrewarded? How many families had been bankrupted by medical bills, forced to choose between treatment and financial survival? How many people were carrying hidden burdens and untold stories of courage, invisible to those who had never been forced to test their own limits? The Scotch had loosened his inhibitions enough to allow a painful truth to surface in Marcus's mind. He wasn't actually angry at Thomas Mitchell for being homeless. He was angry at himself for being exposed as someone whose advantages had been inherited rather than earned, whose success was built more on luck and privilege than on genuine merit or virtue. The Veteran's Medal of Honor represented everything that Marcus secretly feared he lacked: real courage, authentic sacrifice, and a life lived in service to something greater than personal gain. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, Marcus had made a decision that would have seemed impossible 12 hours earlier. He was going to find Thomas Mitchell and attempt to make amends for his inexcusable behavior. It wouldn't undo the damage he had caused or erase the cruelty he had displayed, but it might represent a first step toward becoming the kind of person who deserved the privileges he had always taken for granted. The task of locating a homeless veteran in a city of over 2 million people seemed daunting, but Marcus had resources that most people lacked. His first call was to his personal assistant, instructing her to contact every homeless shelter, veterans organization, and social service agency in the metropolitan area. He wanted Thomas Mitchell found, and he was prepared to offer whatever incentives necessary to make that happen. His second call was to Caroline in Seattle, eating humble pie and asking for guidance about how to approach someone he had wronged so dramatically. His sister's initial response was skeptical, questioning whether Marcus was genuinely remorseful or simply trying to manage the public relations damage from the viral video. But as he explained his sleepless night and growing understanding of his own moral failures, Caroline's tone began to soften. "The first thing you need to understand," Caroline told him, "is that homeless people are often invisible by choice as much as circumstance. If this man has been living on the streets while maintaining his dignity and protecting his daughter from knowing his situation, he's probably very good at avoiding attention when he wants to." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "The second thing you need to understand is that your money can't fix this, Marcus. You can't just write a check and make everything better. Real redemption requires genuine change, not just temporary charity." Her words stung because they were true. Marcus's first instinct had been to use his wealth to solve the problem, to overwhelm Thomas with financial assistance until the veteran's circumstances improved. But Caroline was right that such an approach would be just another form of self-serving behavior, designed more to make Marcus feel better about himself than to address the deeper issues at stake. The search for Thomas Mitchell proved more challenging than Marcus had anticipated. Despite his resources and connections, the veteran seemed to have vanished from his usual locations around the city. The staff at local shelters recognized his description but reported that he rarely stayed in the same place twice, preferring to maintain his independence even in his reduced circumstances. Several social workers mentioned having tried to help him in the past, only to have him politely decline assistance that might compromise his privacy or dignity. It was during his visit to the downtown Veterans Affairs office that Marcus finally got his first real lead. A counselor named Patricia Reeves recognized Thomas's description immediately and confirmed his military record, though she was initially reluctant to share any information with Marcus until he explained his connection to the viral video incident. "Tom Mitchell is one of the most respected veterans I've ever worked with," Patricia told Marcus, her voice carrying deep admiration. "He comes in here every few weeks to check on benefit applications and to help other vets navigate the system. Never asks for anything for himself, just wants to make sure everyone else is getting the help they need." The counselor's description of Thomas's selfless behavior even in his own time of need made Marcus feel even worse about his treatment of the veteran. While Marcus had been focused on accumulating more wealth and status, Thomas had been quietly serving others despite his own desperate circumstances. "I can't tell you where he is," Patricia continued, "but I can tell you that he usually comes in on Thursday afternoons to volunteer with our housing program. If you really want to make things right with him, that might be your best opportunity." Thursday was 3 days away, giving Marcus time to consider how he wanted to approach Thomas when they finally met again. The simplest option would be a straightforward apology, but Marcus was beginning to understand that his behavior had been symptomatic of deeper character flaws that required more than surface contrition to address. He spent those 3 days researching veteran homelessness, medical bankruptcy, and the challenges faced by military families transitioning to civilian life. The statistics were sobering: thousands of veterans experiencing homelessness on any given night, with many more living in precarious situations just one crisis away from losing their housing. The stories were even more heartbreaking: decorated heroes sleeping in their cars, Purple Heart recipients choosing between medication and food, families torn apart by the financial stress of medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. Thomas Mitchell's story was not unique, Marcus realized with growing horror. It was tragically common, representing a systemic failure to care for those who had sacrificed the most for their country's freedom and security. The veteran's dignity in the face of such adversity was remarkable not just for its individual strength, but for how rarely such strength was acknowledged or supported by the society that had created the conditions requiring it. Thursday afternoon arrived gray and drizzling, with low clouds that seemed to mirror the weight Marcus felt pressing down on his shoulders. He had barely slept the previous night, his mind cycling through possible conversations with Thomas Mitchell, rehearsing apologies that sounded hollow even in his own thoughts. The Veterans Affairs building sat in a part of downtown that Marcus rarely visited, a utilitarian structure surrounded by social service agencies and community organizations that served populations invisible to his usual social circle. Marcus parked his Bentley 2 blocks away, suddenly conscious of how his luxury vehicle might be perceived in this neighborhood. He had chosen his clothing carefully that morning, opting for khakis and a simple button-down shirt instead of his usual designer suits, though he suspected his attempt at dressing down would fool no one. Everything about him still screamed privilege and wealth, from his manicured fingernails to his expensive haircut. The VA building's waiting room buzzed with quiet activity when Marcus entered. Veterans of various ages sat in mismatched chairs, some filling out paperwork, others waiting for appointments or simply seeking shelter from the rain. The atmosphere was respectful but informal, with conversations conducted in low voices and occasional bursts of camaraderie between men and women who shared the common bond of military service. Patricia Reeves was exactly as Marcus had imagined her during their phone conversation, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that missed nothing. She greeted Marcus with professional courtesy but obvious skepticism, making it clear that she was prepared to remove him from the premises if his presence caused any disruption. "Mr. Wellington," she said, extending a firm handshake. "I want to be clear about something before we go any further. Tom Mitchell doesn't know you're coming, and I won't have him ambushed or put in an uncomfortable position for your benefit. If he doesn't want to speak with you, that's the end of it." Marcus nodded his understanding, appreciating Patricia's protective stance even as it highlighted his own predatory behavior at the shopping center. "I completely understand. I'm not here to force anything. I just want the opportunity to apologize, if he's willing to listen." Patricia studied his face for a long moment, apparently searching for signs of genuine remorse versus calculated public relations maneuvering. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her to some degree, because she gestured toward a row of chairs near the back of the waiting room. "Tom usually arrives around 2 o'clock. He helps other veterans navigate the housing application process, translates documents for Spanish-speaking clients, and basically serves as an unofficial counselor for anyone who needs it." He's been volunteering here for about 6 months, ever since he first came in seeking assistance himself. The description of Thomas's volunteer work sent another pang of shame through Marcus's chest. While fighting his own battle with homelessness, the veteran was dedicating his time to helping others facing similar struggles. It was a level of selflessness that Marcus found both admirable and incomprehensible, having spent his own life focused primarily on personal gain and advancement. As 2 o'clock approached, Marcus found himself growing increasingly nervous. The other veterans in the waiting room occasionally glanced in his direction with expressions ranging from curious to suspicious. His expensive watch and manicured appearance marked him clearly as an outsider, someone whose presence required explanation. He began to wonder if his attempt at reconciliation was itself another form of selfishness, potentially disrupting Thomas's safe space in order to salve his own conscience. At 5 minutes past 2, Thomas Mitchell walked through the front doors of the VA building. He wore the same faded denim jacket Marcus remembered from their encounter, though his jeans appeared to have been recently washed and his boots showed signs of recent polishing. His canvas backpack hung from one shoulder, and he carried a manila folder filled with what appeared to be housing applications and other official documents. Thomas's demeanor was relaxed and confident as he greeted several veterans by name, inquiring about their families and checking on the progress of their various benefit applications. It was clear that he was well-liked and respected within this community, valued not just for his expertise but for his genuine concern about their welfare. The easy camaraderie between Thomas and his fellow veterans highlighted the profound isolation that Marcus felt in his own life, surrounded by admirers but lacking authentic connections. When Thomas finally noticed Marcus sitting in the back corner of the waiting room, his expression shifted from surprise to wariness. The veteran's body language became more guarded, though he maintained his composure with the discipline that 24 years of military service had ingrained in him. He spoke briefly with Patricia, who gestured toward Marcus and appeared to be explaining the situation. After what felt like an eternity, Thomas approached Marcus's corner of the waiting room. Up close and without the emotional charge of their previous encounter, Marcus could see details he had missed before, the laugh lines around Thomas's eyes, the careful way he carried himself that suggested old injuries, the calluses on his hands that spoke of manual labor and self-reliance. This was a man who had clearly lived a full and complicated life, whose current circumstances represented only the most recent chapter in a much longer story. "Mr. Wellington," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying neither hostility nor warmth. "Patricia tells me you wanted to speak with me. I have to admit, I'm curious about what you have to say." Marcus stood up, his throat suddenly dry despite the careful preparation he had done for this moment. "Mr. Mitchell, I owe you the deepest possible apology for my behavior at the shopping center. What I said to you was inexcusable, and I'm deeply ashamed of how I treated you." Thomas regarded him steadily, neither accepting nor rejecting the apology. "I appreciate you saying that. But I have to ask what changed your mind. 3 days ago, you seemed pretty convinced that I was worthless. What's different now?" The question cut straight to the heart of Marcus's moral crisis. Was he here because he had genuinely recognized the error of his ways, or simply because the public exposure had forced him to confront consequences he couldn't avoid? The honest answer was probably both, but Thomas deserved better than calculated contrition. "When you showed me what was in your backpack," Marcus began slowly, "it forced me to confront some very uncomfortable truths about myself. I realized that I've been judging people's worth based on their current circumstances rather than their character or contributions. I realized that my privilege has made me arrogant and cruel." Thomas listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. Around them, the normal activities of the VA office continued, but Marcus felt as though they were speaking in a private bubble removed from the surrounding world. "More than that," Marcus continued, "I realized that everything I thought I knew about success and failure was wrong. You've accomplished things I never will, sacrificed things I've never been asked to sacrifice. You've served something greater than yourself while I've only served my own interests." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, considering Marcus's words. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured and thoughtful. "I won't pretend that what you said didn't hurt. Not because it was cruel, though it was, but because it reminded me of how far I've fallen from where I used to be. There was a time when people looked at me with respect, when my opinion mattered, when I had something valuable to contribute. The admission of vulnerability in Thomas's response caught Marcus off guard. He had expected either forgiveness or continued anger, not this honest acknowledgement of the veteran's own struggle with dignity and self-worth. It highlighted how much damage had been done not just by Marcus's specific cruelty, but by a society that routinely dismissed and ignored people facing difficult circumstances. But the thing is, Thomas continued, I know who I am regardless of where I'm sleeping or what people think when they look at me. My worth isn't determined by my current situation any more than yours is determined by your bank account balance. The words carried a quiet strength that made Marcus feel small in comparison. Thomas had found a way to maintain his essential dignity despite losing everything material, while Marcus had let material success become the foundation of his entire identity. The veteran's self-possession in the face of adversity revealed just how fragile Marcus's sense of self really was. I'd like to do something to help, Marcus said, immediately regretting how inadequate the offer sounded. Not to make myself feel better, but because it's the right thing to do. Thomas's expression grew wary again. What kind of help are you talking about? Marcus had anticipated this question and spent considerable time thinking about his answer. His first instinct had been to offer Thomas a large sum of money, enough to secure housing and get back on his feet immediately. But Caroline's warning about the limitations of financial solutions had made him reconsider that approach. I don't know, Marcus admitted. I was hoping you could tell me what would actually be helpful versus what would just make me feel like I've done something meaningful. The honesty of the response seemed to surprise Thomas, who had probably expected Marcus to arrive with a predetermined plan that served his own interests more than the veteran's needs. Most people don't ask that question. They assume they know what someone like me needs without bothering to find out. Thomas gestured toward the manila folder he had been carrying. You want to know what I really need? I need these housing applications processed faster than the current 6-month waiting period. I need medical care for injuries I sustained in Iraq that the VA system is too overwhelmed to address promptly. I need job training that recognizes the skills I developed in the military instead of treating me like I'm starting from zero. Each item on Thomas's list represented a systemic failure rather than an individual need that could be addressed with a simple donation. The housing shortage for veterans wasn't caused by lack of funding but by bureaucratic inefficiency and political indifference. The medical delays weren't about equipment or facilities but about understaffing and prioritization. The employment challenges weren't about ability but about civilian employers who couldn't see past stereotypes about military personnel. Those are all problems that money alone can't solve, Marcus observed. Exactly. And they're not just my problems. Every veteran in this building is dealing with some version of the same issues. Help me, and you're helping one person temporarily. Address the underlying systems, and you might actually make a lasting difference. Thomas's analysis revealed a sophisticated understanding of social problems that Marcus had never developed despite his business success. The veteran thought in terms of root causes and systemic solutions, while Marcus had always focused on surface symptoms that could be addressed through individual transactions. What would addressing the underlying systems look like? Marcus asked. Thomas leaned back in his chair, his demeanor becoming more animated as he shifted from personal vulnerability to advocacy for his fellow veterans. Start with the housing situation. The city has hundreds of empty apartments owned by landlords who won't rent to people with gaps in their employment history or credit problems. Meanwhile, qualified veterans are sleeping in their cars because they can't get past the application requirements. He pulled out his phone and showed Marcus a spreadsheet he had created tracking vacancy rates across different neighborhoods. I've been documenting this for months. There's enough empty housing to solve veteran homelessness completely, but the system isn't designed to connect people with available resources. The level of research and analysis Thomas had conducted while homeless impressed Marcus enormously. The veteran had approached the problem with the same methodical intelligence he had probably brought to military logistics, identifying patterns and inefficiencies that professional bureaucrats had missed or ignored. What about the medical issues? Marcus asked. Thomas's expression grew more serious. The VA doctors are good people doing their best with impossible caseloads. I've been waiting 8 months for surgery on my knee, which makes it harder to work physical jobs. Other guys are waiting even longer for mental health support. The resources exist, but the system can't deliver them efficiently. As Thomas described the various challenges facing veterans in their city, Marcus began to understand the scope of the problem he had stumbled into through his cruel behavior at the shopping center. This wasn't about individual charity or personal redemption, but about institutional failures that affected thousands of people who had served their country honorably. Patricia Reeves approached their corner of the waiting room, checking to see if everything was going well. "Tom, your 2:30 appointment is here. Mrs. Rodriguez needs help with her husband's disability claim." Thomas stood immediately, his attention shifting to his volunteer responsibilities. "Of course. Mr. Wellington, this has been an interesting conversation. I appreciate you coming here and being willing to listen." Marcus rose as well, realizing that their dialogue was ending just as he was beginning to understand its true significance. "Could we continue this another time? I'd like to learn more about what you're working on here." Thomas studied Marcus's face for a moment, apparently trying to gauge his sincerity. "Are you serious about wanting to help with systemic issues, or are you just looking for a way to feel better about what happened at the shopping center?" The directness of the question forced Marcus to examine his own motivations more honestly than he had been willing to do before. "I think it started as wanting to feel better about myself," he admitted. "But listening to you talk about these problems, I'm starting to understand that this is bigger than my guilty conscience." Thomas nodded slowly. "All right. I'm here every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. If you want to understand what's really going on, come back next Tuesday prepared to work, not just write checks." With that, Thomas walked away to help Mrs. Rodriguez with her husband's disability claim, leaving Marcus standing alone in the VA waiting room with a head full of new questions and a growing sense that his encounter with Thomas Mitchell was going to change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Over the following weekend, Marcus found himself unable to concentrate on his usual activities. The sailing trip he had planned with business associates felt frivolous and self-indulgent. The charity gala he was scheduled to attend seemed like performative philanthropy designed more to enhance his social status than address real problems. Even his weekly massage and spa treatments felt excessive when he thought about Thomas Mitchell volunteering at the VA while dealing with untreated injuries from his military service. Instead of his normal routine, Marcus spent Saturday morning researching veteran homelessness statistics and policy papers about housing assistance programs. The data was sobering. Over 30,000 veterans experienced homelessness on any given night, with many more living in precarious situations just one crisis away from losing their housing. The causes were complex and interconnected, involving everything from inadequate disability benefits to discrimination by landlords to the challenge of translating military skills into civilian employment. By Sunday evening, Marcus had filled a legal pad with notes about potential intervention points in the systems Thomas had described. His business training had taught him to identify inefficiencies and bottlenecks, and the veteran services landscape was full of both. But he was also beginning to understand that good intentions and business acumen wouldn't be sufficient to navigate the political and bureaucratic complexities involved. Tuesday afternoon found Marcus back at the VA building, this time dressed in older clothes and carrying a notebook instead of trying to manage his appearance for maximum social impact. Patricia Reeves greeted him with slightly less skepticism than before, apparently having heard positive feedback about his previous conversation with Thomas. Thomas arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, greeting other veterans with the same warm familiarity Marcus had observed before. When he reached Marcus's corner of the waiting room, he carried a different manila folder and wore an expression of cautious optimism. "You came back," Thomas observed. "I wasn't entirely sure you would." "I said I wanted to learn what's really going on here," Marcus replied. "I meant it." Thomas gestured toward a small conference room adjacent to the main waiting area. "Good. Because I have something to show you that might change how you think about this whole problem." The conference room contained a rectangular table surrounded by mismatched chairs and walls covered with informational posters about veteran benefits and services. Thomas opened his folder and spread out a collection of documents that appeared to represent months of careful research and analysis. "This is what I've been working on since I started volunteering here," Thomas explained. "I call it the Veterans Housing Initiative. It's a comprehensive plan to address homelessness among military veterans in our metropolitan area." Marcus leaned forward to examine the documents more closely. The plan was remarkably thorough, including detailed budgets, implementation timelines, and partnerships with existing service organizations. Thomas had identified specific funding sources, regulatory requirements, and potential obstacles, approaching the problem with the same systematic intelligence that had earned him military decorations. "This is incredibly sophisticated," Marcus said, genuinely impressed by the scope and detail of Thomas's work. "How long have you been developing this?" "About 4 months. I started putting it together after I realized that individual case management wasn't addressing the root causes of the problems I was seeing here every week. We needed something bigger, something that could actually move the needle on veteran homelessness citywide." Thomas walked Marcus through each component of the initiative, explaining how emergency housing assistance would be coordinated with job training programs, medical services, and long-term support systems. The plan addressed not just immediate needs but the underlying factors that kept veterans trapped in cycles of instability and dependence. The total budget for year 1 would be about $8 million, Thomas continued. "That sounds like a lot, but it's actually less than the city currently spends on emergency services for the homeless population. The difference is that this approach would produce lasting results instead of just managing crisis situations." Marcus studied the budget projections, recognizing the financial logic behind Thomas's proposal. The veteran had identified ways to redirect existing funding streams more efficiently rather than simply requesting additional resources that might not be available. It was exactly the kind of innovative thinking that Marcus valued in his business operations. "Have you presented this to anyone in city government?" Marcus asked. Thomas's expression grew slightly bitter. "I tried. Made appointments with 3 different city council members and 2 department heads. Most of them were polite but clearly didn't take me seriously. I think my current living situation undermines my credibility, regardless of the quality of the proposal." The dismissal of Thomas's plan because of his personal circumstances was exactly the kind of prejudice Marcus had displayed at the shopping center, replicated at an institutional level. The veteran had developed a potentially transformative solution to a major social problem, but his homelessness had made him invisible to the very officials who had the power to implement his ideas. "What would it take to get this plan taken seriously?" Marcus asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment, apparently considering whether to trust Marcus with his honest assessment. "It would take someone with credibility and connections to champion it. Someone who can get meetings with decision-makers and isn't dismissed because of their personal circumstances." The implication was clear, and Marcus felt the weight of the opportunity Thomas was presenting to him. This wasn't about individual charity or personal redemption, but about using his privilege and influence for genuinely meaningful change. The veteran was offering him a chance to transform his guilt into constructive action that could benefit thousands of people. "Would you be willing to work with me on this?" Marcus asked. "Not as someone who needs my help, but as a partner in making this happen?" Thomas studied Marcus's face carefully, apparently trying to determine whether this offer represented genuine commitment or another form of self-serving behavior. "What would that partnership look like?" "I won't be anyone's poster child or mascot." Marcus appreciated the veteran's wariness, recognizing it as a form of self-protection born from experience with people who wanted to help for the wrong reasons. "I'm thinking we approach this as equals. You have the expertise and the plan. I have the connections and resources to get it implemented. We both have something essential to contribute." Thomas extended his hand across the conference table. "All right, Mr. Wellington. Let's see if we can actually make something happen." The handshake felt different from any business agreement Marcus had ever entered into. This wasn't about profit margins or competitive advantage, but about using their combined abilities to address a problem that affected real people living difficult lives. For the first time since the encounter at the shopping center, Marcus felt genuinely hopeful about his ability to transform his privilege into something constructive. Over the following weeks, Marcus threw himself into the Veterans Housing Initiative with an intensity that surprised even his closest associates. He rearranged his schedule to spend 2 afternoons per week at the VA building, learning about the challenges facing homeless veterans and refining Thomas's proposal based on feedback from service providers and potential beneficiaries. The collaboration between Marcus and Thomas developed into an unlikely but effective partnership. Marcus's business connections provided access to city officials who had previously ignored Thomas's requests for meetings, while Thomas's intimate knowledge of the veteran community ensured that their proposals addressed real needs rather than theoretical problems. Together, they refined the initiative into something that was both politically feasible and operationally practical. Marcus also began to understand the personal cost of Thomas's volunteer work. The veteran spent his days helping other people navigate bureaucratic systems while his own situation remained precarious. He continued to sleep in shelters or occasionally outdoors when shelter space wasn't available, yet devoted his energy to developing solutions for the broader veteran community rather than focusing solely on his own needs. The contrast between Thomas's selflessness and Marcus's previous self-absorption was stark and humbling. The veteran had found ways to maintain his dignity and purpose despite losing everything material, while Marcus had let material success become the entire foundation of his identity. Thomas's example suggested that genuine worth came from contribution rather than accumulation, from service rather than self-interest. During one of their afternoon planning sessions, Marcus asked Thomas directly about his ability to maintain such commitment to helping others while facing his own struggles with homelessness and uncertainty. Thomas was quiet for a long moment before responding. "When Sarah was sick, I spent 2 years watching someone I loved fade away despite having access to the best medical care money could buy. It taught me that some problems can't be solved with individual effort or resources, no matter how desperate you are or how much you're willing to sacrifice." He gestured toward the folders of veteran case files scattered across the conference table. "But these problems can be solved. Not for everyone, and not immediately, but they're solvable with the right approach and sufficient commitment. I can't bring my wife back or undo my financial losses, but I can help make sure other veterans don't face the same barriers I've encountered." Thomas's explanation revealed a philosophy of action born from profound loss and disappointment. Rather than being paralyzed by his personal tragedies, he had found ways to channel his pain into constructive effort on behalf of others facing similar challenges. It was a level of emotional maturity and moral clarity that Marcus recognized as far beyond his own development. Their partnership also exposed Marcus to aspects of veteran culture and military service that he had never understood before. Through Thomas's introductions, he met combat veterans dealing with PTSD, former medics struggling to find civilian employment that utilized their medical training, and career military personnel who had difficulty adjusting to the less structured environment of civilian work. Each individual story added depth to Marcus's understanding of the systemic problems they were trying to address. Veteran homelessness wasn't caused by laziness or personal failure, but by the intersection of multiple factors including service-related injuries, inadequate transition support, employer discrimination, and housing costs that had outpaced benefit increases. The solutions required coordination between multiple agencies and sustained commitment over years rather than months. By the end of their first month working together, Marcus and Thomas had secured meetings with 4 city council members, 2 county commissioners, and the director of the Regional Housing Authority. The Veterans Housing Initiative was beginning to gain traction among local officials who recognized both its financial logic and its potential for meaningful impact. But more importantly for Marcus personally, the partnership had begun to transform his understanding of success and purpose. Working alongside Thomas had shown him what authentic leadership looked like, the ability to inspire others through example rather than authority, to maintain hope despite setbacks, and to find meaning through service rather than accumulation. The veteran had become not just a collaborator but a teacher, demonstrating qualities of character that Marcus was only beginning to develop in himself. As they prepared for their most important presentation yet, a formal pitch to the city's budget committee, Marcus realized that his encounter with Thomas Mitchell in the shopping center had set in motion changes that went far beyond public apologies or charitable donations. He was becoming a fundamentally different person, someone who measured his worth by his contributions rather than his possessions, someone who understood that true privilege came with genuine responsibility to use it constructively. The transformation wasn't complete, and Marcus suspected it would take years to fully integrate the lessons Thomas was teaching him. But for the first time in his adult life, he felt like he was living according to values that extended beyond his own narrow interests. The homeless veteran who had absorbed his cruelty with such dignity was showing him what it meant to be genuinely successful, and Marcus was discovering that real achievement had very little to do with the size of his bank account. The mahogany conference table in City Hall's budget committee room reflected the afternoon sunlight streaming through tall windows, casting geometric shadows across the polished surface where Marcus Wellington and Thomas Mitchell had arranged their presentation materials. 3 months of intensive preparation had led to this moment, and Marcus could feel his heart racing despite decades of high-stakes business negotiations. This felt different, more consequential than any corporate deal he had ever pursued. Councilwoman Janet Rivera entered first, followed by Budget Director Alan Chen and Housing Authority Director Margaret Stevens. The three officials had agreed to this special session after weeks of preliminary meetings and growing pressure from veteran advocacy groups who had learned about the initiative through word of mouth at the VA Center. Marcus stood to greet them, but his eyes remained fixed on Thomas, who displayed the same calm composure he had shown during their first encounter at the shopping center. Thomas wore a navy blazer that Marcus had purchased for him, though the veteran had initially resisted accepting anything that felt like charity. They had eventually agreed that professional attire was an investment in the initiative's success rather than personal assistance, but the compromise had required delicate negotiation that highlighted the complex dynamics of their partnership. "Gentlemen," Councilwoman Rivera said as she took her seat, "I have to say that your preliminary materials were quite compelling. We're eager to hear your full presentation." Marcus opened their prepared remarks, but as he looked around the formal conference room, he realized that his usual corporate presentation style would be inappropriate for this setting. These officials needed to understand not just the financial logic of the Veterans Housing Initiative, but the human reality behind the statistics and budget projections. 3 months ago, Marcus began, deviating from his scripted introduction, "I was a very different person than I am today. I believed that success was measured by wealth accumulation, that poverty was always the result of personal failure, and that homeless people were somehow less deserving of dignity and respect than those of us who had been more fortunate." The candor of his opening seemed to surprise the city officials, who had probably expected a more conventional policy presentation. Thomas nodded encouragingly from his seat, understanding that Marcus was choosing authenticity over political calculation. "Then I met Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Mitchell," Marcus continued, "and learned that everything I thought I knew about success and failure was wrong. Tom isn't just the co-architect of the proposal you're about to hear. He's proof that homelessness can happen to anyone, regardless of their character, contributions, or commitment to serving others." Marcus gestured toward Thomas, who stood and moved to the front of the room with quiet confidence. The veteran had insisted on presenting the technical aspects of their proposal himself, wanting city officials to hear directly from someone who understood the challenges from personal experience. "Good afternoon," Thomas said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to briefing senior officers. "I want to start by sharing some data that might surprise you about veteran homelessness in our metropolitan area." Thomas activated the presentation screen and displayed a map showing the concentration of homeless veterans across different neighborhoods. Red dots marked emergency shelter locations, blue dots indicated VA service centers, and yellow dots showed affordable housing developments. The visual immediately revealed the disconnect between where services were located and where veterans actually needed them. "We currently have over 400 veterans experiencing homelessness on any given night," Thomas continued. "But that number represents only the visible cases. Our research indicates that another 800 veterans are in precarious housing situations, staying with friends or relatives, living in overcrowded conditions, or one financial crisis away from losing their housing entirely." Budget Director Chen leaned forward with obvious interest. "Those numbers are much higher than our current estimates. How did you arrive at them? Thomas smiled slightly, recognizing the implicit skepticism in the question. I spent 6 weeks conducting direct interviews with veterans at shelters, VA appointments, and community centers. Unlike official surveys, which rely on self-reporting through formal channels, this approach captured people who avoid traditional services for various reasons. The methodology Thomas described was more rigorous than most academic research Marcus had seen, yet it had been conducted by someone who was himself homeless during much of the data collection period. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room that their most accurate information about veteran homelessness had come from someone the system had failed to house. Thomas advanced to the next slide, which showed a breakdown of the root causes behind veteran homelessness in their city. The primary factors are medical debt, inadequate disability benefits, employer discrimination, and housing costs that have increased faster than military pensions or VA compensation. These aren't individual failures but systemic problems that require coordinated solutions. Housing Authority Director Stevens raised her hand. We've tried various approaches to veteran homelessness over the years. What makes your initiative different from previous efforts? Thomas had anticipated this question and was prepared with a comprehensive answer. Previous programs have focused on crisis intervention, providing emergency assistance after veterans have already lost their housing. Our approach emphasizes prevention and rapid rehousing, addressing problems before they become crises and providing comprehensive support to ensure long-term stability. He clicked to a flowchart showing how their proposed system would work. Veterans at risk of homelessness would be identified through early warning indicators like missed rent payments, medical emergencies, or job losses. Immediate financial assistance would be coupled with job training, medical care, and ongoing case management to address underlying causes rather than just immediate symptoms. The total cost for year 1 would be $2 million, Thomas continued. That sounds substantial, but it's actually less than we currently spend on emergency services for the homeless population. More importantly, this approach would produce measurable results within 12 months and become cost-neutral within 3 years. Marcus watched the city officials process this information, recognizing the expressions of people who were genuinely intrigued by what they were hearing. Thomas's presentation had transformed abstract policy discussions into concrete solutions backed by solid research and clear implementation plans. Councilwoman Rivera asked the question Marcus had been dreading. This is certainly ambitious. But I have to ask about funding sources. Where would $2 million come from in our current budget environment? Thomas looked toward Marcus, indicating that this was the moment for their partnership to demonstrate its full value. Marcus stood and moved to the presentation screen, pulling up financial projections he had developed based on his business experience and knowledge of city budgeting processes. We've identified 4 primary funding streams, Marcus began. First, federal grants specifically designated for veteran housing programs, which currently aren't being fully utilized due to application complexity and administrative capacity limitations. Second, reallocation of existing homeless services funding toward this more efficient model. Third, partnerships with private foundations and corporate sponsors who have expressed interest in supporting veteran causes. He paused before revealing the 4th funding source, knowing it would be the most surprising to everyone in the room. Finally, I'm personally committing $2 million over 3 years to ensure the initiative has sufficient startup capital and operational flexibility. The announcement of Marcus's financial commitment created a moment of stunned silence around the conference table. Thomas smiled with genuine warmth, apparently pleased that Marcus had chosen to make this announcement publicly rather than positioning it as a private negotiation point. Budget Director Chen was the first to recover from his surprise. Mr. Wellington, that's an extremely generous commitment. But I have to ask about your motivations. What's your interest in this particular issue? Marcus had anticipated this question as well, though he wasn't sure his honest answer would be politically helpful to their cause. My interest began with guilt and embarrassment after I publicly humiliated Tom at a shopping center 3 months ago. But it's evolved into something much deeper as I've learned about the scope of veteran homelessness and the inadequacy of our current response. He gestured toward Thomas, who was listening with obvious appreciation for Marcus's willingness to be vulnerable in this formal setting. Working with Tom has taught me that my wealth is meaningless unless it's used to address problems that actually matter. This initiative represents the first time in my adult life that I've committed my resources to something bigger than my own interests. Councilwoman Rivera nodded approvingly. That kind of honesty is refreshing in these discussions. But beyond personal motivations, what makes you think this partnership will be effective long-term? Thomas stood again, sensing that this question required his perspective rather than Marcus's. I think our partnership works because we bring complementary strengths to complex problems. Marcus has connections and resources that can open doors I can't access alone. I have direct experience and community credibility that can ensure our solutions address real needs rather than theoretical problems. The veteran's analysis was characteristically thoughtful and strategic, focusing on practical outcomes rather than personal dynamics. More importantly, this initiative isn't dependent on our individual involvement. We're building institutional capacity and systemic changes that will continue functioning regardless of who's managing them day to day. Over the next hour, the three city officials asked detailed questions about implementation timelines, performance metrics, coordination with existing services, and potential obstacles to success. Thomas and Marcus tag-teamed their responses, with Thomas handling technical and operational issues while Marcus addressed financial and political considerations. By the end of the presentation, the mood in the conference room had shifted from polite skepticism to genuine enthusiasm. The officials were clearly impressed not just by the comprehensiveness of the proposal but by the unlikely partnership that had produced it. Gentlemen, Councilwoman Rivera said as the formal session concluded, I want you to know that this is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need on complex social issues. You'll have our preliminary response within 2 weeks, but I can tell you that this proposal will receive serious consideration. As the city officials gathered their materials and prepared to leave, Budget Director Chen approached Marcus privately. I have to say, this represents a remarkable transformation from the person I saw in that viral video. What you're doing here could genuinely change lives. The reference to the shopping center incident sent a familiar pang of shame through Marcus's chest, but it was tempered by recognition of how far he had traveled since that moment of moral failure. The video that had initially embarrassed him had ultimately led to the most meaningful work of his life. After the officials departed, Marcus and Thomas remained in the conference room to debrief their presentation and discuss next steps. The afternoon sunlight had shifted, casting longer shadows across the mahogany table where they had just made their case for transforming how the city addressed veteran homelessness. That went better than I expected, Thomas said, loosening his tie with obvious relief. I wasn't sure how they'd react to the scope of what we're proposing. Marcus nodded, still processing the intensity of the previous 2 hours. Your presentation was outstanding. The way you handled their questions about methodology and implementation showed exactly why this initiative needs your expertise. Thomas looked toward the windows overlooking the city center, his expression thoughtful and slightly melancholic. You know, there was a time when presenting to officials like that felt natural, even routine. Military briefings, congressional testimony about overseas operations, strategic planning sessions with Joint Chiefs. I never thought I'd be in that position again after everything fell apart. The admission revealed the depth of loss that Thomas had experienced beyond just his financial and housing situation. He had gone from being a respected voice in important national conversations to someone whose opinions were dismissed because of his current circumstances. The Veterans Housing Initiative represented not just a potential solution to social problems but a restoration of Thomas's ability to contribute meaningfully to policy discussions. Speaking of contributions, Marcus said, I need to tell you something about the funding commitment I announced in there. Thomas turned his attention back to Marcus with curiosity and slight concern. What about it? Marcus had been wrestling with how to share this information without making Thomas feel uncomfortable or obligated. The $2 million I pledged isn't actually a sacrifice for me. My net worth is sufficient that this amount won't meaningfully impact my lifestyle or financial security. I mention that not to diminish the commitment, but to be honest about what it represents. Thomas nodded slowly, apparently understanding the distinction Marcus was trying to make. You're saying this isn't charity or noblesse oblige, but using resources where they can have the most impact. Exactly. I've realized that hoarding wealth while people like you struggle with problems that money could help solve isn't just selfish, it's actively harmful. This funding commitment is as much about my own moral development as it is about helping veterans. Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering Marcus's words. I appreciate the honesty. It would be easy for you to position this as great personal sacrifice and expect gratitude in return. Acknowledging your privilege while still choosing to use it constructively feels more authentic. Their conversation was interrupted by Marcus's phone buzzing with a text message from his sister Caroline in Seattle. She had been following the Veterans Housing Initiative through social media posts and news coverage, watching her brother's transformation from a distance with apparent amazement. Saw the news coverage of your presentation today, Caroline's message read. Mom called to say she's proud of the man you're becoming. So am I. This is the Marcus I always hoped was in there somewhere. The message from Caroline hit Marcus with unexpected emotional force. His sister's approval meant more to him than any business success he had ever achieved, representing validation from someone whose opinion was based on character rather than financial performance. More importantly, it suggested that his transformation was visible to people who had known him his entire life. Good news? Thomas asked, noting Marcus's emotional response to the text. Marcus showed him Caroline's message, not out of need for validation but because Thomas had become someone with whom he could share genuine feelings without judgment. My sister works with homeless populations in Seattle. Her opinion of my character has always mattered more to me than I was willing to admit. Thomas smiled with understanding. Family members who choose service careers have a way of keeping the rest of us honest about what really matters. As they gathered their presentation materials and prepared to leave City Hall, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that morning at the shopping center. The encounter that had initially represented his worst impulses had somehow catalyzed a transformation that touched every aspect of his existence. His business relationships had evolved as he began applying ethical considerations to investment decisions and corporate partnerships. Several deals that would have been profitable but socially questionable had been abandoned in favor of opportunities that aligned with his developing values. The financial cost of these choices had been minimal, but the psychological impact had been profound. His social circle had also shifted as Marcus found himself less interested in the superficial conversations and conspicuous consumption that characterized his previous peer group. Instead, he was drawn to people engaged in meaningful work, whether in nonprofit organizations, public service, or socially conscious business ventures. The Veterans Housing Initiative had introduced him to an entire network of people whose lives were dedicated to addressing problems rather than accumulating possessions. Most significantly, his relationship with Thomas had evolved from guilty obligation to genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The veteran's quiet wisdom and authentic integrity had become a constant source of learning and inspiration for Marcus, challenging him to examine his assumptions and expand his understanding of what constituted a life well lived. 2 weeks later, Councilwoman Rivera called with news that the Budget Committee had approved the Veterans Housing Initiative with full funding for the first year and provisional approval for years 2 and 3 pending performance metrics. The decision represented not just a victory for homeless veterans but validation of the partnership model that Marcus and Thomas had developed. The announcement celebration was held at the VA Center, surrounded by veterans who would be among the first beneficiaries of the new program. Marcus watched Thomas receive congratulations from men and women who had witnessed his own struggles with homelessness while he worked to develop solutions for their shared challenges. The veteran's joy was quiet and dignified, reflecting satisfaction and meaningful accomplishment rather than personal glory. During the informal reception, Marcus was approached by Dr. Sarah Kim, a psychiatrist who specialized in PTSD treatment for combat veterans. She had been following the initiative's development and wanted to discuss expanding the program to include enhanced mental health services. What you and Tom have created here could serve as a model for other cities, Dr. Kim said. The combination of immediate housing assistance with comprehensive support services addresses the complexity of veteran homelessness more effectively than anything I've seen. The conversation with Dr. Kim highlighted something that Marcus was only beginning to understand. The Veterans Housing Initiative had implications that extended far beyond their local community. Thomas's systematic approach to analyzing and addressing veteran homelessness could be replicated in other metropolitan areas, potentially helping thousands of veterans nationwide. As the celebration continued around them, Marcus found a quiet moment to speak with Thomas privately. The veteran was standing near a window overlooking the city center, the same urban landscape where he had been homeless just months earlier. "How does it feel?" Marcus asked, joining Thomas at the window. Thomas was quiet for a moment before responding. "Surreal, mostly. 6 months ago, I was sleeping in shelters and having my ideas dismissed because of my personal circumstances. Now we're implementing a program that could help hundreds of veterans avoid the same situation." He turned toward Marcus with an expression of genuine gratitude. "But more than that, I feel like I have a purpose again. Sarah always said that meaning comes from using your gifts to serve something bigger than yourself. This initiative has given me a way to do that." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what Thomas meant. "I've been thinking about that too. This work has shown me what I was missing in my previous life. All that wealth and success felt empty because it wasn't connected to anything meaningful." Thomas smiled slightly. "You know, there's something I never told you about that day at the shopping center. When you were berating me in front of all those people, I wasn't angry with you. I was sad for you." The admission surprised Marcus. "Sad for me? Why?" "Because I recognized something in your behavior that I'd seen before in combat zones. When people are truly confident in their worth, they don't need to prove it by diminishing others. Your cruelty that day suggested someone who was deeply insecure despite all his apparent success." Thomas's psychological insight was characteristically perceptive, identifying the root cause of Marcus's behavior more accurately than Marcus himself had understood it at the time. The public humiliation of a homeless veteran had indeed been an attempt to establish superiority through comparison, revealing profound uncertainty about his own value despite material advantages. "I think you were right," Marcus admitted. "I had confused accumulating wealth with building character. When I saw you sitting there, something in me recognized that you possessed qualities I lacked, and I reacted defensively." Thomas nodded with understanding. "The ironic thing is that your initial cruelty ended up leading to something genuinely meaningful for both of us. Sometimes our worst moments become doorways to better versions of ourselves." As the reception began to wind down, Marcus and Thomas made plans for the next phase of their work together. The Veterans Housing Initiative would require ongoing oversight and refinement as it was implemented, but they were also beginning to discuss broader applications of their partnership model. Thomas had been invited to speak at a national conference on veteran services, sharing lessons learned from their successful collaboration with city government. Marcus was exploring opportunities to replicate their approach in other cities, potentially creating a nationwide network of veteran housing initiatives based on their template. But beyond the professional opportunities, both men understood that their partnership had produced something more valuable than policy changes or program implementations. They had demonstrated that authentic transformation was possible, that people from completely different backgrounds could work together effectively when united by shared values and genuine commitment to serving others. The homeless veteran who had absorbed public humiliation with dignity had shown a wealthy businessman what real strength looked like. The millionaire who had initially dismissed the Medal of Honor recipient as worthless had learned to use his privilege constructively. Together, they had created something that neither could have accomplished alone, proving that meaningful change often emerges from the most unlikely collaborations. As Marcus drove home that evening, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The transformation hadn't been comfortable or easy, requiring him to confront aspects of his character that he had preferred to ignore. But the process had also revealed possibilities for purpose and fulfillment that he had never imagined were available to him. His penthouse apartment looked the same as always, filled with expensive possessions and offering spectacular views of the city below. But Marcus experienced the space differently now, seeing it not as a symbol of his superiority but as a resource that carried responsibilities. The wealth and privilege that had once isolated him from others could be tools for addressing problems that mattered, connections to meaningful work rather than barriers to authentic relationships. The next morning, Marcus woke with a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with financial markets or business deals. Thomas would be arriving at the VA Center to begin training the staff who would implement their housing initiative, and Marcus would join him for the first session. They had work to do, lives to change, systems to improve. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Wellington had discovered what it meant to be genuinely successful. 1 year later, Marcus Wellington stood in the same spot at the Grandview Shopping Center where he had once humiliated Thomas Mitchell. The marble floors still gleamed under fluorescent lights, shoppers still moved with purpose through the corridors, but everything felt different now. Today, he wasn't here as a customer but as a guest speaker for the center's annual charity drive supporting local veterans. The fountain area had been transformed into a small presentation space with folding chairs arranged in neat rows. A banner hanging above read "Honoring Those Who Served" with photographs of local veterans displayed on easels around the perimeter. Marcus recognized several faces from the VA Center, men and women whose stories he had learned over the past months of working alongside Thomas. Thomas arrived precisely on time, wearing a crisp white shirt and the same navy blazer from their city council presentation. But today he carried something different, a leather portfolio instead of his worn canvas backpack. His daughter Emma walked beside him, a young woman in her 20s with her father's intelligent eyes and her mother's warm smile. She had driven down from college specifically for this event, finally ready to learn the full story of her father's struggles and triumphs. The shopping center's manager, Linda Hayes, introduced Marcus to the gathered crowd of about 50 people. Many were staff members from surrounding stores, others were shoppers who had stopped to listen, drawn by curiosity about the millionaire who had publicly apologized to a homeless veteran and then partnered with him to create meaningful change. Marcus approached the microphone with none of the arrogance he had displayed during his first visit to this location. His prepared remarks sat folded in his jacket pocket, but he had decided to speak from the heart instead of relying on scripted words. "A year ago, I stood right here and made the worst mistake of my adult life," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly across the small crowd. "I saw a man sitting quietly by this fountain and decided he was worthless based on nothing more than his appearance and circumstances. I was wrong about everything." He gestured toward Thomas, who sat in the front row with Emma beside him. That man was Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Mitchell, a decorated combat veteran who had sacrificed more for his country and his family than I had ever been asked to sacrifice for anything. His apparent poverty wasn't evidence of failure but of the most profound kind of success, the willingness to lose everything material in service of something greater. The crowd listened with respectful attention as Marcus described the journey that had begun with his cruel behavior and evolved into partnership and friendship. He spoke about the Veterans Housing Initiative, which had now helped over 200 veterans find stable housing while providing comprehensive support services to ensure long-term success. "But the most important thing I learned," Marcus continued, "wasn't about homelessness or veteran services or even social justice. I learned that privilege without purpose is meaningless, that true wealth comes from contribution rather than accumulation, and that the people we're quickest to dismiss often have the most to teach us." When Marcus finished speaking, Thomas took the microphone for the first time in their public appearances together. He had always preferred to work behind the scenes, focusing on program development and implementation rather than publicity. But today felt different, a moment requiring his voice and perspective. "I want to thank Marcus for his honesty about what happened here," Thomas said, his tone measured and thoughtful. "His initial behavior was painful, but it led to something neither of us could have imagined. Sometimes our worst moments become doorways to our better selves." Thomas looked directly at his daughter, his expression soft with love and pride. "Emma, I need you to know that everything I went through, every night without a roof, every day wondering how to keep going, was worth it because it led me to work that matters. The Veterans Housing Initiative has become my second career, a way to serve that feels as meaningful as anything I did in uniform." Emma stood and embraced her father, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the full scope of what he had endured and accomplished. The applause that followed was genuine and sustained, coming from people who recognized they had witnessed something authentic and transformative. After the formal presentation concluded, Marcus found himself surrounded by store employees and shoppers asking questions about volunteer opportunities and ways to support veteran services. The engagement was gratifying, but what touched him most deeply was watching Thomas sign copies of the Veterans Housing Initiative manual that had been published by the city and was now being adopted by municipalities across 3 states. Linda Hayes approached Marcus as the crowd began to disperse. "I have to say, when I first heard about what happened here last year, I was mortified that such an incident occurred at our center. But seeing what it led to, how it brought people together and created positive change, makes me think sometimes good things can emerge from difficult beginnings." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I'm not grateful for my behavior that day, but I'm grateful for everything it taught me about myself and about people like Thomas who respond to cruelty with grace." As they walked toward the parking area, Emma fell into step beside Marcus while Thomas talked quietly with a young veteran who had approached him after the presentation. She had her father's directness but with less caution, speaking her mind without the careful diplomacy that military service had instilled in Thomas. "He never told me about living in the van," Emma said quietly. "I knew things were tight financially after Mom died, but I had no idea how bad it actually was. He protected me from all of it." Marcus chose his words carefully, understanding how difficult it must be for Emma to learn about her father's struggles. "He did what good parents do. He absorbed the hardship so you could focus on your education and future." Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I feel terrible that he was going through all that alone while I was complaining about college stress and social drama. I should have known, should have helped somehow." "You did help," Marcus replied gently. "You gave him a reason to keep going when everything else had fallen apart. Your success in school, your determination to become a teacher, your love for him, that's what sustained him through the worst of it." Emma looked toward her father, who was still deep in conversation with the young veteran. "He's different now than he was before Mom got sick. Sadder but also stronger somehow. Like he understands things about life that he didn't before." Marcus recognized the insight in Emma's observation. Thomas had indeed been changed by his experiences with loss and homelessness, but the change had deepened rather than diminished his capacity for compassion and service. Suffering had taught him lessons that prosperity never could, making him a more effective advocate for others facing similar challenges. Thomas rejoined them as they reached the parking area, his expression reflecting the satisfaction of meaningful connection with someone who needed guidance. "Young man just got out of the army, having trouble finding work that uses his technical skills. I gave him contact information for our job placement coordinator." The casual way Thomas referred to our program highlighted how completely he had embraced his role in the Veterans Housing Initiative. What had begun as Marcus's attempt at redemption had evolved into Thomas's calling, a way to transform personal adversity into systematic change that benefited thousands of people. As they prepared to part ways, Emma hugged Marcus with surprising warmth. "Thank you for seeing who my father really was, even after treating him so badly at first. Thank you for giving him a way to matter again." The simple phrase "matter again" captured something essential about Thomas's journey from invisible homeless veteran to recognized expert whose innovations were being implemented nationwide. Marcus had provided access and resources, but Thomas had supplied the vision and expertise that made their collaboration meaningful. After Emma and Thomas drove away, Marcus remained in the parking lot for several minutes, processing the emotions stirred up by returning to the scene of his moral failure and personal transformation. The shopping center looked exactly the same, but his relationship to this place had been completely altered by everything that had grown from that moment of cruelty and revelation. His phone buzzed with a text from Caroline in Seattle, who had been following news coverage of their presentation. "Watch the video online. You've become the person I always hoped you could be. Love you, brother." Marcus smiled, recognizing how much his sister's approval meant to him and how dramatically his priorities had shifted over the past year. Success was no longer measured by quarterly earnings or net worth statements but by the number of veterans housed, the programs replicated in other cities, and the relationships built through authentic service to others. Driving home through the city streets where Thomas had once searched for safe places to sleep, Marcus reflected on the unpredictable nature of personal transformation. A moment of inexcusable behavior had somehow catalyzed changes that touched hundreds of lives, proving that redemption was possible even for those whose failures had been witnessed by thousands of people through viral video. The Veterans Housing Initiative continued to expand, but more importantly, the partnership model he and Thomas had developed was inspiring similar collaborations between privileged individuals and affected communities across the country. Their story had become proof that meaningful change required authentic relationship between people with different resources and perspectives, working together toward shared goals that transcended individual interests. As Marcus pulled into his building's parking garage, he realized that his penthouse apartment no longer felt like a refuge from the world but like a base camp for engaging with it more constructively. The wealth and privilege that had once isolated him had become tools for addressing problems that mattered, connecting him to purpose and community rather than separating him from both. Thomas Mitchell had taught him that true success came not from what you accumulated but from what you contributed, not from what you possessed but from what you were willing to sacrifice for others. The homeless veteran carrying a Medal of Honor in a worn backpack had shown a millionaire what genuine wealth looked like, and both their lives had been transformed in the process. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.